Clearly some pretty speculative reasoning happened on the emissions cap that even a week later doesn't look like it's correct. There's a need in this country to bring down air pollution that costs lives, here in Canada. Letting a new US administration and their oil and gas CEO friends dictate Canadian policy to us is not the precedent of weakness and pliability to set right now. Hi everyone, this is Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast. Once again, we will be going the normal introduction to this podcast episode. Suffice it to say that if you'd like to take action on environmental issues, please check us out at sierraclub.ca. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Why do we repeatedly see climate policies, like the emissions cap, become a scapegoat for our economic problems? Why is the narrative constantly that either we protect the environment or the economy, when it's increasingly clear you can't protect the economy without environmental protections? Why do so many of our media organizations follow in the path of social media misinformation and accept this framing outright every time it comes up, copy-pasting industry arguments into articles and editorial positions without a second thought? That's ultimately what today's episode is all about. And it's going to be discussing the emissions cap policy. This is a policy that, if you haven't tuned in to us before and haven't heard of before, would cap the pollution of the oil and gas corporations that are the leading cause of pollution in this country, and the leading cause why we've constantly failed to meet climate targets. It would be lovely to think that eliminating a climate policy could fix Canada's looming US trade issues, could fix our high grocery prices, and could fix our economy as a whole. But as an exercise, try rereading that last sentence in the mirror to yourself and see if you can take that idea seriously. If you can't, it's because the idea is ridiculous to begin with. Maybe we could remove the requirement for cars to have seatbelts, or reduce health and safety regulations for factories and farms so that they can operate without looking after their workers. Either one of those actions would lower the costs for corporations. How about removing all testing and labeling requirements for new medications, cosmetics, supplements? That would make the operations of drug companies cheaper for sure. Or how about removing food safety standards? Of course, if we did any of those things, we'd then be flooded with untested drugs, car crash deaths, industrial and farming fatalities and accidents. And having gotten food poisoning this year, I'm not terribly interested in repeating that experience. And I'm definitely not interested in removing food safety requirements either. My point is that we already regulate different corporate sectors in so many ways, often specifically based on the activities they are involved in and the potential risks that those activities come with. A fair cap on emissions could likewise save thousands of Canadian lives from reductions in ambient air pollution alone before even considering the climate benefit. And then there's the billions saved in associated health costs. Yet the idea of regulating Canada's most polluting sector, composed of oil and gas corporations that have failed to do the bare minimum to cut emissions, suddenly that's weird? Well, it shouldn't be that weird. But we constantly see opportunistic arguments coming out to try and make it sound like it's weird. Take the recent fears circulating about US tariffs given the rise of an incoming US administration that's vowed to drill baby drill. Oil and gas advocates immediately argued that potential tariffs and competition from new oil and gas development in the United States meant we should cancel the emissions cap in Canada. Some publications jumped straight on the bandwagon of those arguments against the emissions cap and abandoned instantly any seeming concern for the environmental benefit it could have. In one case, this was actually contrary to the publication's previous support of an emissions cap. Fast forward less than a week from that point, and the situation has changed. Experts are saying that Canadian oil and gas will most likely be exempt from US tariffs. Not that that matters, as we're going to get to in a moment in terms of the emissions cap, one way or the other. And it appears that fears that US oil would be outcompeting Canadian oil are less relevant than previously thought. There are even calls for Canadian oil and gas infrastructure to be expanded to export more to an oil-friendly US regime. Clearly some pretty speculative reasoning happened on the emissions cap that even a week later doesn't look like it's correct. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter what happens with tariffs anyway. For many oil and gas companies, the emissions cap can be met through further methane efforts, extremely cheap given corporate profits that have taken huge amounts from us in inflation. And there are other easy steps that can be taken by corporations like electrifying operations. In other words, the emissions cap, the great oil and gas boogeyman, is never going to be the determining factor into whether or not Canadian oil and gas remains competitive against the United States. If there are tariffs on Canadian sectors at this point, it's more likely they will impact other sectors who already are lowering their emissions instead, rather than oil and gas corporations that have failed to lower their emissions. These are the other sectors that don't have the same maybe powerful friends in Washington. It bears repeating that oil and gas corporations, while only 5% of Canada's economy, are Canada's most polluting sector, causing around 30% of national emissions. Between 1990 and 2022, emissions from oil and sands production grew by 467% and conventional oil production by 24%. Since 2005, emissions overall increased 11%. Per barrel emissions from oil sands also increased since 2018. Meanwhile, again, those other sectors and individual Canadians cut their emissions. That's the point of an emissions cap. If we're really all in this together for Canada at this darkest hour, shouldn't we all be pulling the same weight on emissions reductions? And let's not forget where these tariffs ultimately came from. Climate misinformation, bought and paid for by oil and gas CEOs, is a large part of the radicalization and misinformation that has led to this new US administration having the social license to implement things like tariffs. And what oil and gas CEOs want for the United States, the destruction of lives and suppression of dissent that we are likely to witness very soon, we can pretty safely say, given their communications efforts in Canada, that that's what they want for us too. It's clear now, within days, that the anti-emissions cap tariff argument was garbage. It was another excuse to scapegoat climate policy in order to distract from the actual causes of the problems that we face. But, in terms of the media, was this an innocent mistake? Did the media in Canada just mess up? If so, it's a mistake we keep seeing repeated. And I want to cite two recent examples here. During recent inflation, many news organizations in Canada repeated and focused on the impacts of carbon pricing on inflation, or emphasized the role implicitly or explicitly of carbon pricing without context from economic experts or counterpoints from environmental voices. Later, coverage slowly started to include more input from economists who quickly pointed out that carbon pricing, no matter someone's personal views on it, agree or disagree, is not a major contribution to inflation. But by that time it didn't matter. In an era when the headline of an article is frequently the message that readers are left with, well, people already made the connection between inflation and the carbon pricing. They thought it was tied directly to each other, and subsequent corrections really were no longer that relevant. Discussions on other causes of inflation and real solutions to inflation largely died out in the noise around carbon pricing. Another example. Following the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, oil and gas corporations tried heavily to sell new oil and gas projects in eastern Canada as the answer to European energy security. This argument was covered extensively by media organizations in Canada, often without context or without accompanying coverage of counter-arguments. There's a pretty major one. What was extensively left out was that such projects would come online years into the future, meaning they would have very little to no impact on immediate energy security in Europe or anywhere else. Again, this eventually became apparent because the case for East Coast liquefied natural gas development has since collapsed from a business case perspective. But the public were led to believe such projects were somehow vital to immediate energy security and economically feasible, largely because of the omission of context and counterpoints. The reality that the security crisis in Europe had also accelerated a green transition there was also often omitted. And some people did do good journalism. But every time there is a crisis, we hear the opportunistic whining of wealthy oil and gas corporations who have cut jobs even when production increases in Canada. Every time, we are encouraged by them to forget about the wildfires that have taken whole communities from us, forget about the fact that insurance companies increasingly won't insure at-risk homes in Canada in places like flood zones, forget about the severe storms, and forget about the lives lost to climate impacts. Every time there's a global crisis, the excuses for inaction on climate change get weaker and more hollow, yet we hear them. In the wake of each of these crises, many news outlets have repeatedly fallen back on copy-pasted arguments ultimately derived from corporate sources. This is problematic not just because of the environmental issues, but because it has also largely distracted us, as I said, from public solutions two environmental, economic, and security issues that can be mutually reinforcing or complementary. Climate change will have more of an economic impact on Canada than any climate policy can. Let me say that again. Climate change will have more of an economic impact on Canada than any climate policy can. There is an urgent need to address climate change and for Canada to show real leadership on climate change given our high per capita emissions, but it's more than just that. There's a need in this country to bring down air pollution that costs lives here in Canada. There's a need to show international leadership, but there's a need to act on climate change here. Adaptation to climate change will simply never be enough to deal with the climate crisis if emissions reductions are not also achieved. And those reductions must be achieved cooperatively now more than ever. I studied climate change adaptation in Canada because I wanted to make a difference. And I got out of that field and into prevention of climate change for this reason. Scapegoating climate policies isn't just the easy way out. It distracts us from real solutions to our problems by focusing attention on fake ones. Even if you think governments are broken clocks, well, broken clocks still tell time twice a day, and on climate policy right now, we're not doing badly. We're not doing great, but we're not doing badly. Many of the regulations we have save lives. An emissions cap could save thousands of Canadian lives through reductions in ambient air pollution alone with a benefit of billions of dollars. That's before considering the cap's benefit to climate and non-fatal pollution impacts. Some of the things I've just said and that I am about to say might offend some journalists and editors, and maybe some will see that as bad media relations. Personally, I don't think you can have a good relationship with someone without being honest. You certainly can't have one if you spend your time begging for equal coverage, afraid to offend anyone. So on behalf of many in the environmental community, here's my letter to you. I do hope this serves as a wake-up call. So many of you, journalists, editors, are doing fantastic work. But misinformation does not just spread by social media. During times of relative global or domestic calm, media coverage of climate issues has generally speaking gotten better. Climate change has become a greater focus for news organizations, and experts and environmental advocates have increasingly received equal coverage to oil and gas, corporate interests, and their supporters in the media. However, once again, with the election of a new U.S. administration, we're seeing a familiar trend emerge when it comes to scapegoating environmental policies for Canada's problems. This doesn't apply to all journalists and editors, but for those it does apply to, there's an important message here. We're getting really tired of seeing environmental policies shot down as a cost to the economy every single time they come up. We're getting tired of seeing only industry sources referenced in articles, or if there are references to the environmental movement and climate scientists, seeing those put at the very bottom of articles where nobody will read them. As climate change gets worse, people are going to ask themselves why we let it get so bad, and we will all have some inner soul searching to do. We are not afraid of our talking points not standing up to oil and gas corporate talking points, so let us fight in the ring. If we really think coverage should equally cover both sides of an issue, even if you think that's fair given the climate science says one side is right and the other side is lying, then let us fight on an even footing at least. I'm not going to defend every environmentalist out there or say we are right all the time. For one thing, the environmental movement for a long time bought into the industry argument that individual action alone can make a difference on climate change, and that was a mistake. The environmental movement has made mistakes. But as journalists, you need to be aware that for decades now, oil and gas corporations have been engaged in a misinformation campaign directly meant to skew the truth or just spread outright lies in a premeditated fashion. Part of that campaign is, of course, aimed at journalists. I'm recording this as backers of the new U.S. administration, ones that came to power again thanks in large part to the radicalization and misinformation of the oil and gas corporations behind them, launched legal attacks on newspapers across the United States for their journalism. If you think Canada is immune to this sort of radicalization, you're wrong, and hiding in the sand will do you no good. Pretending everything is going to be okay will do no good. So if you're not going to stand up for the environment, at least stand up for yourselves as journalists, as editors. Do it so we can start talking about real solutions and not red herrings. We believe, and will continue to believe, in the power of journalism as a force for good in this world. Even if we don't agree with everything that gets published, that belief is still there, even despite the critique. But being a force for good means taking the high road on issues like the environment, not when it's easy, not when there's an easy narrative out there about the environment versus the economy, but precisely when it's most difficult. Precisely when the climate policy scapegoat is at the door is when your work is most needed. The same thing applies for us as a country too. To abandon our principles on climate change is to abandon ourselves. Giving up ground won't save us. Letting a new US administration and their oil and gas CEO friends dictate Canadian policy to us is not the precedent of weakness and pliability to set right now. What's more, many experts see a green shift continuing globally regardless of the new US administration, in large part because other countries realize that relying on oil and gas is prone to mass fluctuations and threats to energy security. It'd be nice if we saw those consequences as well as serious and learned from them. I encourage you to check out our previous episode on renewable energy reliability in Canada because it adds a lot of important context. For all the talk of the unreliability of the green economy, how many of the crises we have faced recently are largely down to our reliance on oil and gas? A lot of them. It's hardly time for Canada to abandon green principles. Many US states will be fighting back for renewable energy and a green shift too. We should stand with them and with the many Americans who will very soon need our help more than ever in a lot of different ways. To quote the UN Environment Programme, every fraction of a degree avoided counts in terms of lives saved, economies protected, damages avoided, biodiversity conserved, and the ability to rapidly bring down any temperature overshoot. The world needs green leaders now more than ever. Canada would be the first country with an emissions cap, is the line we keep hearing. That's the point. Either Canada leads, or we all lose. Before we go today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. And finally, a quick note, in terms of social media, we just joined Blue Sky as Sierra Club Canada, so you can also check us out there. For more information about the emissions cap, check out the link in the podcast description.